this situation. As was mentioned, there are some artifacts at the History Center. I hope that when circumstances and time permits, you'll have an opportunity to go and see them. The Aransas Pass Road is a fascinating road. I learned about it when I was part of the Rosenberg Railroad Museum, my hometown, Rosenberg, Texas, and we were developing a museum for all of Fort Bend County. And the San Antonio and Aransas Pass, the Houston line came through the northern part of Fort Bend County in about 1888 to 1890. And so we had a retired employee from the Southern Pacific who really wasn't around the days when the Aransas Pass was an independent road, but certainly had worked at some of the agencies like Wallace and such when the SP was running part of that line. So it's been a real fascination. When I first kind of got into collecting artifacts, the very second artifact I picked up was a tall lantern. It didn't have a marked globe, but it was marked SANAP. And I found it at an antique show in the early 90s. And within a few months, I found a kerosene oil can, which would have been used to fill a lantern, much like the one I had, at a show in a few months. And I remember longtime collectors telling me how hard it was to find stuff for the Aransas Pass line. And here I found, a couple items in 4 months, and I was brand new. And I thought, well, I don't know what these guys are talking about. Well, those are about the last artifacts I saw for like 4 years for this line. Back before the internet and eBay and stuff made it easier. You really had to go to shows or to such to find such artifacts. And so I gained an appreciation for those artifacts. There's a lantern like that on display in Rockport, and that oil can I was telling you about is actually the one that's on display there in Rockport. So again, I hope you have a chance to go and see it. But a fascinating history. I'm not going to cover the history here. The exhibit in Rockport does a fine job of talking about how the Aransas Pass came to be as an independent line and its takeover a couple times by the Southern Pacific. They also have some wonderful photographs of some area depots, including Rockport and Aransas Pass. I'm going to show you a few photographs from other depots in the area, but I'm actually going to start off with this image here of the first excursion. This is from a cabinet card photo, and as you can read on there, it was the first excursion to Floresville from San Antonio, and it was taken, the excursion happened January 25th, 1886. And the photographer Stravinoha put some notes in there. The first survey for the Aransas Pass was September 10th, 1884. The first rail laid was August 17th, 1885, and now the first engine to Floresville, January 7th, 1886, and the first excursion to Floresville, January 25th, 1886. So you can see there that this is a picture of what was called locomotive number 3 on their roster. And back then they were, in addition to numbering locomotives, they were naming them. This was the Augustus Belknap. He apparently at one time was on the board, at least maybe the founding board, that was working the Aransas Pass. I know Augustus Belknap was a civic leader in San Antonio, and he was president of a streetcar company there. This locomotive here was an interesting one built by Baldwin in 1885, and it was called a 244T, and the numbers stand for the wheel arrangement. So it has 2 small wheels at the front, 4 driving wheels in the center. Those are the big wheels, and then it has kind of a built-in tender, and that's the 2 trailing, actually the 4 trailing wheels. That's why it's called the 244 for the wheel arrangement. These were good for locomotives that didn't have to go very far because you didn't have a lot of room for fuel in the tender, and so these weren't good necessarily for long-haul service. And that's why typically, the Aransas Pass, this seems to be maybe perhaps only locomotive of its type that was bought by that road, but certainly there weren't many, and they didn't last long because you needed to stop for fuel a lot more frequently for a locomotive like this. But still, it's a very nice early photograph of a historic event on the Aransas Pass Road, and I wanted to share that with you. This was built by Baldwin in 1885, and it was acquired secondhand by the SNAP sometime that year. And that seemed to be kind of a trend for the Aransas Pass. They didn't have a lot of money. They built on a shoestring. Most of the rail that they bought was secondhand rail and such as that. And a lot of their right-of-way, they didn't bother to pour ballast down, which meant that, the ties sat directly on the ground, and You know, you had a lot more problems with washouts and such if you didn't do the foundational work that was necessary. So they cut corners kind of where they could to build their line, hoping they could improve it later. And in some cases they were, in some cases they weren't. But like I said, a fascinating look at a Texas road. I'm going to move on to the next photograph here, which is the depot at Mathis with a nice passenger train. This is probably taken somewhere around 1905 to 1910. And what you kind of notice about it, again, if you've seen the exhibit or if you've seen pictures of the depots, the Aransas Pass depots had this pretty standard look to them with the hip roof. And especially what's kind of unique is that the signal out there, that the semaphore signal, I have not seen another one exactly like this, certainly for any of the Texas roads. The Aransas Pass may have actually made them themselves or they ordered them special from a shop, but they're somewhat unique in that capacity. But what you see here is, you know, a photographer set up photographing the passenger train. Looks like they're loading or unloading something from the baggage car. There's two gentlemen sitting on or standing on the baggage cart, and of course a whole slew of men and women out there watching the train, because that was the thing to do when the train came to town, was go out and see who was getting on the train, who was coming off, and what news they had to carry. Because in those days, other than the local newspaper, the only really news you got was when people came into town. And of course, the depot typically also had a telegraph wire, and news would sometimes come off of that wire that the depot agent would share with people. So a nice photograph of Mathis, Texas. My next photograph is Portland. And of all the images I've seen of the depots of the Aransas Pass, this one has to be the tallest for a non-two-story building. I'm not really sure why, but this building's about 8 to 10 feet, I'm estimating, taller than like the depot you just saw at Mathis, and which was typical for the line. In fact, you know, they basically had to kind of put a joint in there and run boards up there. So not sure why Portland got this designation, having such a tall depot. I don't know what they would have needed to ship that was that tall, or store. Maybe they put in some sort of an internal second story in there, but not a very common view. Haven't seen a lot of views from Portland, Texas, and so I thought I would put this out there today for your enjoyment. Next, I wanted to talk about Epworth by the Sea. This has kind of a interesting history, and I'm showing you two basically snapshots of the Sanborn fire map. This one is from 1914, and I'm going to read you a little bit about what Epworth was all about, and basically this comes from the Handbook of Texas Online. The Epworth League was basically a Methodist youth organization, and that was especially strong in Texas, and it was authorized in 1890 by the General Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church South, and local churches in Texas soon began organizing their youth in Epworth Leagues. The purpose of the leagues was to develop young church members in their religious life and to provide training in churchmanship. It was parallel to the Sunday school and typically met on Sunday nights. The name Epworth came from the boyhood home in England of John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement. A Texas State Epworth League was organized in 1892, and leagues across the state were attracting 10,000 members by 1896. In the early years, there was a state league newspaper. In 1905, state encampment grounds were secured near Corpus Christi Bay and called Epworth by the Sea. More than 1,000 persons gathered there annually until a tropical storm in 1915 led to the sale of the property. So I showed that here's like the close-up here, and you can see the Aransas Pass line served that, and there was also a spur that went out over the water. And the first, I have a couple of views, basically railroad related. This first one, you can actually see Camp Epworth here in the background. You can see the tents and a few buildings. And here's the track that's going out over the sea, and this is actually what's called a scale car, where they would test scales to, to adjust them and such. And so this is actually, SA&AP Maintenance of Way Scale Car 623. And you can see somebody wrote on there, "Have you seen this before?" Somebody named Katie, who sent this postcard, was asking the receiver if they'd ever seen Camp Epworth. And so in the background is Camp Epworth. And really, I collected this card because of the not knowing what Camp Epworth was, but because it had this neat scale car that you don't see a lot of pictures of for the Aransas Pass line. And so again, this was taken in 1906. The next photograph I have is also from 1906. This one is August 7th, and it's entitled Depot Scene, Camp Epworth. And so you actually have people either waiting to catch the train and leave Camp Epworth, or maybe some of them have, are waiting for transport from the railroad depot to have their belongings, taken to their tent or whatever sort of place they were going to stay. But I found I learned a lot about Camp Epworth just from actually picking up these two photographs, and it's probably, I don't know how much history is of the area there and about Camp Epworth, but certainly was for about a dozen years or so was added a lot of tourists and I'm sure, buoyancy to the local economy as they had these annual meetings there at Camp Epworth. Next, I want to show you a photo that's unusual. This one is entitled Icing Cars at Aransas Pass, Texas. Before the days of refrigeration, they had ice bunkers in cars. The cars were called reefers for refrigerator car. And along the lines, there would be ice bunkers where they would store this ice. It would be a lot of times shipped from up north where there were, in the wintertime, they would harvest ice and it would be held in ice bunkers and it would be shipped south. And there were several places along the lines where they would ice cars, especially if you were loading it with perishables like fruit or maybe oysters or something like that. But I didn't know there was such a place in Aransas Pass, Texas, obviously, until I saw this photograph. So another wonderful photograph showing people actually working on the railroad. And one of the things that was a necessity up until refrigerator cars really came into being in the really latter part of the 1920s and 30s, where they were used widely. And so you had to have ice plants and the people to man them and do this. And so this is one from the local area. Next, I'm going to show you what's called this is basically an award badge. It's a cap badge, and it does say Southern Pacific Line's Locomotive Fireman. And but this was basically what's called an award badge. Mostly it wasn't worn. It was given as what was called a fuel conservation award. Starting in World War I, when there were fuel shortages, the railroads all implemented fuel-saving protocols that the engineers and firemen, the locomotives especially, were to abide by. And to sort of encourage their cooperation in this effort, each division would give fuel awards quarterly to the top locomotive engineer and the top fireman. That award was basically this badge. And so this badge, like I said, most guys never wore, maybe a few did, but most times they were basically just put in a box and probably sat on the bureau or sat in their dresser drawer, because it was basically an award. This one, however, was issued, and here's the back of the badge, so it was engraved to a gentleman named Felix McKinney on September the 30th, 1926, for fuel conservation. So you can see what the award was basically for. Now, Felix McKinney was born in Skidmore, B County, to a farmer named Felix Chester McKinney and his wife, Martha Elizabeth, on October the 1st, 1890. He was 9 and one of 6 children in the 1900 census, and in 1910 census, he is living with his widowed mother and a couple of siblings in Skidmore, a 19-year-old railroad watchman. Guessing that it may have been watching boiler readings in the yard there, although there's no more specifics. By the 1920 census, Felix is 26 and single and living at 607 Simpson Street in Yoakum with his mother, his sister Clara, who was a clerk in the railroad office, and a younger brother. Felix was listed as an engineman. That's basically what we call an engineer. He basically married within a year or two after this, and by the 1930 census finds him age 39, a railroad engineer, and his 35-year-old wife, Elizabeth. Now, at the time that this award was given in 1926, I'm going to go back one and show you it was actually given for locomotive firemen, even though he was already qualified as an engineer. But he was pretty low on the totem pole, and in the railroad, you had assignments based on your seniority in the system. And so at the time this award was given, McKinney only probably had about a year or so. I think his date is 1925 when he became an engineer. And so if you really want to stay employed on the railroad, you had to take whatever job came along. And because he was low man on the engineer seniority roster, but a lot higher on the fireman seniority roster, he would still take assignments as fireman. And so at the time that he was awarded this badge, even though he was on the engineer's roster, he got the award as a fireman because he probably worked more trips as a fireman than an engineer. Over time, obviously, as he got more seniority and stuff, that would change. And at some point, he probably wouldn't work as a fireman nearly at all. But here in this particular point in time, he did. So I said in 1930 census, he was age 39, a railroad engineer with his 35-year-old wife, Elizabeth. They were living in Yoakum with her elderly parents. By 1940 census, an interesting question that didn't appear on the previous said, where did you live in April of 1935? And he listed Yoakum and that he was a steam locomotive engineer. In the 1940 census, Felix was age 49, his wife Elizabeth 49, and they're living with their 9-year-old daughter, Mary, at 1042 Caton Avenue in San Antonio. With them is his 79-year-old mother-in-law, Mary Carnes. He listed his occupation as a locomotive engineer for a steam railroad. Even though he was too old to be called up, he was required to register for the draft in 1942. And on that document, he still lives at 1042 Caton Avenue in San Antonio, working for the Texas-New Orleans Railroad, who had acquired the SANAP out of the Roundhouse in San Antonio. By the 1950 census, it hasn't been released yet, but the rest of the story was basically found via his death certificate. He was still at 1042 Caton Avenue and still a locomotive engineer when he died suddenly at home of a coronary occlusion at 5:30 p.m. on July the 3rd, 1956, aged 65 years and 9 months. The death certificate indicated he was an Army veteran, probably having served in World War I, and he was buried in Mission Burial Park. The best guess here is that he went to work for the San Antonio Rangers at some point before 1910, was promoted to fireman, then engineer in the teens or 20s, and worked as an engineer until his death in 1956. So that's pretty much the story of Felix McKitty. But there's an interesting turn on this. His daughter, Mary McKinney, was born in Yoakum in 1930, and she died in San Antonio in 2009. She never married, and she was the McKinney's only child. She was well educated and taught school in San Antonio for 25 years in Catholic and public schools. She went back to school in the 1990s after she retired, went to University of Texas in San Antonio. She left University of Texas San Antonio upon her death, $22 million in scholarships to help financially strapped kids go to school like some she met after returning to college, after so many years. And it seemed that her father, Felix, a railroad engineer, was very frugal and invested money in land in South Texas to the tune of 5,200 acres that now sits on the Eagle Ford Shale Formation, full of oil, and now be worth as much as $28 million. Many of the articles about Mary McKinney say that she was so unassuming that no one suspected that she would be worth anything like that because she lived very frugally, but she donated that money to that. So a very unusual turn for Mr. McKinney's daughter, who did well with the legacy that he left her. But interesting what you can learn just from an artifact from an employee on the Aransas Pass Road. Next, I want to go to this gentleman, James Carroll Cherry, and the exhibit in Rockport has some artifacts with his name on them. I came across several things with him. Mr. Cherry was, as you can see, born in Giddings, Texas, 1892. He died in Houston in 1929 at age 37 in Harris County. He's buried in the Giddings City Cemetery. Let me pull up the details on that. When I did some research on him, I found that basically there was a little more detail that he died in the Southern Civic Hospital. Back in those days when you worked for the railroad was one of the very first to have what we would call today a health maintenance organization. And you could have small fee deducted from your wages every pay period, and you basically got pretty much free health care. You could see a local doctor. They would triage you. You could, they would take you maybe to the local hospital, but at some point they transfer you to the company hospital. And for the Southern Civic lines, the SB hospital is in Houston. The building actually still stands. I believe it's apartments or something. But so he died in the SB hospital in Houston after a 15-day stay of hypertensive heart disease, 2 years duration. The contributing cause was he'd had a tonsillectomy. And like I said, he's buried in the Giddings City Cemetery. How he's related basically to Rockport is that on the April 21st, 1912, Carroll Cherry, he sometimes went by his middle name instead of James, Carroll Cherry is mentioned in Rockport Society Gathering. A 1913 trip pass that I have lists him as the SANAP agent in residence at Rockport, Texas. So he was agent there for a while, and subsequent passes through 1916 show him as agent in Rockport, Texas. He was drafted in 1917, and his draft card shows his occupation as telegrapher Rockport. On November the 8th, 1919, he was discharged from the United States Navy and resumed his duty as Agent Rockport. His draft registration doesn't really say what he did, other than the fact that he was in the Navy at that point in time. An April 1st, 1920 news story from Rockdale shows that he is actually the agent there. And in 1922, we know he's the agent in Flatonia, Texas. At some point at that point, he married Elsie, let me get her name, sorry. He married Elsie Buck of, in Hill Country. He basically was married at her home on July the 18th, 1923, at her parents' home. And he had met her, and so they actually lived then in Aransas Pass. In 1924, he became the agent at Aransas Pass, Texas, and he remained that agent in Aransas Pass until his death. In June the 12th of 1924, they had twins, James Carroll Jr. and Jane Elizabeth. Now, Jane Elizabeth only lived a few days, and he died in the 12th of May, 1929, as we mentioned earlier. So it was interesting, again, having found this connection that Mr. Cherry was agent first in Rockport until World War I, then in Aransas Pass from 1924 to his death in 1929. There are some, there's artifacts that the exhibit has copies of. As you can tell from his tombstone, he was a member of the Masonic Lodge. I believe, even though he traveled around, he joined in Rockport and maintained his membership there. And one of the interesting things, and again, like I said, they have a picture of this, but this is his actual lodge receipt from Rockport from the year 1919. And of course, you know that a big event happened in Rockport that year, basically being the big hurricane that happened and wiped out a good part of it. And like a lot of receipts, they had basically an embosser where they would emboss the receipt so you would know it was legitimate, because no one could duplicate that embossing. Well, this particular receipt doesn't have an embossing on there, and of course, you may not be able to read the bottom, but it basically says, "Seal destroyed by storm." And so they didn't have an embosser because it was basically lost in the great 1919 hurricane. And so it kind of gives you a nice tie-in with an artifact to the local history of some big event that happened. So that's really the end of my formal presentation on the Aransas Pass of the stuff I wanted to share with you. I'll certainly open it up to any questions or comments.
All right, thank you so much, Ken. Really appreciate that. Really fascinating stuff. As far as questions, we do have a couple people here in person, and we'll start with them. And for everybody that's online, feel free to use the chat box, and we'll be sure to get your questions if we can. So anybody here, does anybody have any questions for Ken?
Ken, can you tell us, this is Phil Stravinoha, can you tell us how long the Aransas Pass line was in business?
So officially started, like I said, the first excursion in 1886. The very first annual pass that I've seen was issued in 1887. So certainly, already running by then. By the time you're issuing annual passes, you have a line that somebody actually wants to ride on. So it operated under its own power up until 1890, and there was a wreck on the Lavaca River in Hallettsville, and the lawsuits from that wreck pretty much broke the road. And so they were under receivership for 2 years. One of the receivers was a guy named McNamara. Another one was basically Benjamin Franklin Yoakum, who had been the vice president and general manager. And at the end of the receivership in 1892, they were taken over by the Southern Pacific Organization, but maintained somewhat of their autonomy, although SP leadership came in. And so that remained in effect, and it basically was treated as a second-class road. They paralleled the Southern Pacific in a lot of areas, and so they moved along, as it were. So all of a sudden, in 1903, Yoakum, after he exited the Aransas Pass and was as a receivership, went to work. He was the third vice president for the Gulf, Colorado, and Santa Fe for a while, and then he joined the St. Louis and San Francisco and Rock Island, and he was basically chairman of both of those railroads. They were under joint ownership at the time. And so he remembered that when he was with the Aransas Pass, they wanted to build into South Texas, basically to serve Brownsville. And that had been one of Yoakum, that had been actually one of Uriah Lott's dreams, was to serve South Texas, but he never quite made it until the railroad, went broke. So it is assumed that he called him either some political favors or some such, because back then the Texas Railroad Commission actually regulated railroads. It doesn't do that today, even though it has that name. But the Railroad Commission suddenly decided that in 1903, really almost 12 years after the SP acquired ownership of the Aransas Pass, that they had to divest themselves of that line. And so, at least on paper, they divested themselves of the stock and such, but a lot of people that were friendly to the Southern Pacific were still running the Aransas Pass line. So it was quote unquote independent from 1903 up until 1925, when they were given permission, Southern Pacific, to reacquire that road, and it was leased to the Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio. So for all intents and purposes, after 1925, there really wasn't a lot of railroad lettered under the SNAP, although the name stuck around probably until the real consolidation under the SP in Texas in 1934. So that gives you kind of a rough line. But of course, parts of the railroad that were the SAP, that were under the Southern Pacific, were around for decades, but they slowly abandoned parts of the line. And there's still a little bit around between Cuero and Yoakum, and a couple other spots there, but that's really all that's left of the line. Hope that answers your question.
A double question for you and for Pam. When you were here a few weeks ago, I asked Pam if anything was ever going to be done with the station here in Rockport, and she said at that time the county commissioners were anticipating some action on that. Do you have any idea, or Pam, an update on that?
I'll let Pam answer that.
Sure. Yes. In fact, I think the Commissioners Court last time voted to accept a grant that would include the depot. And the depot, they're negotiating now for who would run the depot. Part of it would be as that organization, and part of it will be parking for downtown.
Cool.
So definitely going to happen.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There's somebody on the chat box.
I am not seeing it. Ken, are you able to see the chat box? I'm not. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I don't see it.
Okay.
The question is, the question, Ken, is about your time in Eagle Lake and the traffic through the Eagle Lake Depot.
So for any particular time period, or?
No, just in general.
Just in general? Okay. So yeah, Eagle Lake was on the line to Houston. So there would have been some, traffic through there. Probably was not major, because the Southern Pacific had their own route into Houston too. So if you were coming from San Antonio, most of the traffic along the Aransas Pass line would have been from places like Shiner and Yoakum. On to Houston. Probably some stuff from San Antonio that originated on the Aransas Pass, but other stuff there probably would have taken the more direct route, unless for some reason the Aransas Pass had a cheaper tariff. But a decent, probably moderate amount of traffic on that line, because the terminus was Houston, probably more so than some of the other branch lines. But over time, of course, the line was severed in about the mid-1950s, somewhere around Hallettsville to Sheridan, and over time they abandoned that points east and west until all that was left was between really Wallace and Eagle Lake. And that was actually in service as kind of a spur to Chesterville up until really about 10 years ago. But it used to be part of the Bel Air branch after the Southern Pacific took it over, and they would run trains. But the track wasn't as well maintained as under the SP as they maintained some of the other lines. So it was typically slower and such. So as the railroads were cutting back on service, they kept their primary routes a little better maintained than their alternate routes. And so since it had secondary status under the Southern Pacific, it wasn't going to be the fastest route.
Okay, thank you for that. It looks like we have another question from Melanie. When is the Eagle Pass Museum open?
So Eagle Lake Depot is open officially second and fourth Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Although we do take appointments if people have groups or they just want to come some other time. If you let me know in advance, I can open it up. But second and fourth Saturdays 10 to 3 are our official hours.
Okay, and yeah, I think she meant Eagle Lake as opposed to Eagle Pass.
Yeah. And we're on Facebook under Eagle Lake Depot, and we do have a webpage, eaglelakedepot.org.
Okay, thank you. And it looks like that is that's it for the questions.
I'd like to know,
1 second.
when was the last time the depot in Rockport was used?
Did you catch that, Ken?
Used for train service?
Yeah,
I honestly don't know that. I'm not sure when that agency closed. My guess would be, though, probably not later than maybe the 1970s or 80s, but it could have been much earlier than that.
I think it's on a poster back here. We can check it.
okay.
All right.
Somebody else asked about the downtown depot. Or Rockport Depot. Yeah.
Yeah, we already answered that.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that's it. Thank you so much, Ken. We really appreciate it. That was very interesting, very enlightening, and it definitely demonstrated how rich our history is when it comes to the railroad. So thanks again, and apologies to you and to everybody else for some of the technical difficulties. But thank you for bearing with us, and thank you for joining us. So Ken, thank you very much, and I think that'll be it. That will conclude the program, unless you have anything else to add.
I don't. Thank you all for the opportunity and look forward to seeing you guys here in the near future.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You got an echo there.
My computer skills are lacking. I couldn't get in.